I want to firstly welcome all of you to the Buffet of Jewish Thought, and we look forward to hearing our guest speaker, Rabbi David Weinberger, the Rabbi of Congregation Sharei Tefillah in Lawrence, New York.
We're very excited to have Rabbi Weinberger, who he's going to give more details about a very, very famous court case that he was involved in recently. Many of you probably have heard about it, but yeah, we have live in person the rabbi who was involved in the case, and we're very excited to hear what he has to say. Rabbi Weinberger.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it is due to this wonderful luncheon that I'm able to see a little bit more than West Rogers Park and Peterson Park. So when I get back home and someone says you were in Chicago, I can earnestly say, yes, I was in downtown Chicago. The topic at hand is one that I guess has not necessarily fond memories to me when I speak about it, because it involves 4 years of my life in and out of various levels of the New York State court system, and most recently, thank God, a decision to not accept the case in the Supreme Court of the United States. Before I get involved with the issues regarding confidentiality and rabbis and psychologists and attorneys and physicians, let me just briefly give you some of the basic details of the case, and you'll understand my involvement in this particular issue. There was a couple in my community who were filing for divorce, and they had come prior to that to myself and to a colleague for counseling. And numerous discussions ensued. Issues were brought up, things were shared. There had been a separate court battle that was ensuing regarding the custody of the children, and whose custodial care these children should go. These children were being raised in an Orthodox family. They were being raised according to the Orthodox tradition. It was our feeling that they should be maintained in that milieu, in that setting. They were going to an Orthodox school. Without going into particular details, the husband wished to maintain that. The wife had veered off in many ways from her previous way of life, which was clearly according to Orthodox tradition. We had written an affidavit to the court, which we were asked to do by his attorney, by the husband's attorney, stating the things that were disclosed to us, which were not necessarily disclosed in confidence. No statement of that was made. It was just through discussion. We felt clearly impacted upon the psychological, emotional, and religious life of these children. And we felt that the custodial care should go with the father, somewhat atypical in almost all divorce proceedings. The court awarded the father custody, not because of us, but just because of their own reasons and their own feelings. The woman felt that she'd lost custody due to our affidavit and decided to sue us each for $10 million. It was just gratifying to know that somebody thought that I had $10 million that I'd be able to pay out. On the initial level, the lowest level, the first court in New York, in Queens County, the justice ruled that there was a cause of action and that we are liable for breach of confidence. Later on, it turns out that it was clear that there was a third party present in both instances, my colleague and myself, at least on one occasion. And so, although in the initial level of the court we were considered liable for breach of confidence, although awards were not granted because there was no basis for any particular award, it was just a question of law. Did we breach her confidence or did we not? And he felt we did. The next level, the appellate division, they threw it out because of a third party being present. I wasn't happy with that, to be honest with you, because I wanted an issue being written on law itself in maintaining what I believed and my colleague believed to be correct, that as a rabbi we did our duty, and we'll get into a little bit of the Jewish law framework in saying what we had to say and in caring for these children in a way that we felt we had an obligation to do. But as one great rabbi said to me, I don't care how you get out of it, just get out of it. So if you're out of it on a technicality, don't worry about the fact that you'd like it to be written as law. But my dream was fulfilled, because after it won in the appellate division, so the other attorney appealed it further, and in the Court of Appeals, and then finally it was brought to the highest court of New York State. And I was in Albany at the time, sitting in the courtroom, and it was gratifying to see that 7 justices, very well suited in law, very astute, very bright, well versed with the case, when they heard the oral arguments of both attorneys, and a decision was written on the law, which we'll talk about shortly, stating emphatically that there was no issue of breach of confidentiality for the rabbi. He appealed it then to the United States Supreme Court in hope that they would take the case. They categorically dismissed it, and therefore the case is, thank God, over and done with. But it does bring many things to light, and many issues have come up. Recently, I just got a call from a rabbi in England. He's in a similar predicament. What can I tell him? What advice can I offer him? And this issue affects not only rabbis. As you know, there are statutes and there are rules. Different states, I'm well aware, have different guidelines of the clergy penitent privilege, that of an attorney-client privilege, that of the physician and patient privilege. But these are areas for a Jewish person that relate not only to law, although we are quite cognizant of the law and we abide by the law, we are law-abiding citizens, and we have a concept in Jewish law called Dina de Malchusa Dina. The law of the land is the law, and therefore we have to abide by the law of the land and citizenship in which we find ourselves. And that goes by the state, because there are different guidelines of Illinois than there are in New York. But in a basic idea, the 50 states of the United States of America have laws that protect the confidences of the client, of the patient, of the penitent. And we're going to analyze that, what happens when it impacts adversely according to Jewish law. And Jewish law has things to say as well, and so we are become sometimes literally a diverse and polarized force of Jewish law versus the secular law. The clergy penitent privilege, for example, was initiated as early as 1800, and at that time probably more in the Catholic mode, but yet it was written and it stands firm today. But due to our, I guess, celebrated case, it has been clarified in a very significant way. Our argument from the beginning was that as a rabbi and as a penitent, as a congregant coming to an Orthodox rabbi, the understanding is that you expect that I'm going to follow Jewish law, and I will abide by what Jewish law tells me. And if you're coming to an Orthodox rabbi and you're an Orthodox person, the expectation, my expectation is that you would want me to abide by Jewish law as you and I practice it, namely the Orthodox view, according to the Torah. So then later to say, well, you breached confidentiality, I didn't expect you to disclose what I had told you to my husband, is completely out of line. because no statement was made as such, and I had to do what I felt duty-bound according to Jewish law. But I do have a problem. There is a legal law. There is the law of the land that does not allow me to breach confidential information. So the law, as such, as today in New York State, has been not rewritten, but clarified, and a very significant clarification indeed. A major difference between yourselves and myself, those of you that are practitioners, those of you that are practicing attorneys. You are licensed by the state in which you find yourself in, whether it's Illinois, or a person's licensed in New York, or any other state. The court said that a rabbi or a clergyman, a man of the cloth, is not licensed by the state. He gets his smicha perhaps, he gets his ordination, and then he follows his religious doctrine, whatever it may be. You're Catholic, you're Protestant, you're Jewish, you're Orthodox, you're conservative, you're Reform, but you're practicing your position, your law. Far be it from the court to mix in and to interfere as to what you consider to be confidential and what you're obligated to disclose. And so the basic tenet of the court, which was, as I said, a unanimous opinion, basically separated those that are licensed individuals from non-licensed. And since we aren't licensed by the state, then we may practice the law as we see it. That's just the end and final result of it. I'd like to back up and discuss some of the issues that pertain to both of us. They pertain to all of us. And let's try to see if we cannot at least have a general picture of some of the critical issues that are at hand. In Jewish law, the restrictions on confidential information are much more severe than they are in secular law. Now, we're sitting today at a luncheon. If we were to talk about, Mr. Jones and his private life and things that have been going on in his business and inappropriateness, and we would shame him and denigrate him and slander him, according to Jewish law, we just discussed this at lunch or at a dinner or at a coffee clutch meeting. According to secular law, you didn't do anything. You can't be held culpable. You're not liable. You can't be sued. What did I do? How did I punish you? What did I do to you? According to Jewish law, that's a prohibition. It's a prohibition that's known as lashon hara, evil slander. And just the fact that I say something to you and I denigrate the other person, then that itself is a prohibition. That's on the one hand, very strict guidelines that curb and curtail what I may say even to my friend about somebody else. Whether what he did was true and what he did was evil, and I'm still restricted from sharing it with you unless there's some benefit, because perhaps you're going into business with him or you want to join forces in a law firm, and therefore it behooves me to tell you of his illegitimate practices when I dealt with him or what I know. But generally speaking, the doctrine of Jewish law is much broader and much wider in its restrictions of information that's given to me, not necessarily even in a setting of a penitent and a rabbi, but just what's told to me as a friend. This becomes confidential. I may never share it with anybody else. From a secular point of view, there are guidelines to these engaging relationships. Who holds the privilege, for example? And I know there's a major difference, for example, in the clergy penitent privilege between New York and Illinois. And I think I'm going to move here because in New York, in Chicago, or in Illinois, the clergy is the one that holds the privilege. And so I can waive it. In New York, it's the penitent. He holds the privilege, or he or she has to waive it. The clergy may not. In other states, it's a dual waiver, and you require both the clergyman and the penitent to waive the privilege. And so it's complex, and one has to know where you're practicing and what the rules are and the guidelines. But clearly all agree, secular law and Jewish law alike, that there are circumstances that go beyond the scope of confidential information where I must and where I would be obligated to disclose. Let's talk about some of those. And some of these cases, in fact, are famous cases. And I'm not going to go into the details. Just one celebrated case in New York State was People versus Drelich. That was a murder case. And information that was imparted to somebody about an individual who was going to commit murder. But this was said in confidence. Now, a rabbi who then goes to the police and he says that so-and-so confided in me that he plans on Tuesday, July 28th, to commit murder, that's a disclosure which is of necessity. And everybody understands that there's no breach of confidentiality. We're dealing with somebody's life. We're dealing with life and death. And that's true of the attorney-client privilege as well. There are certain situations that rise above that confidentiality. A person harming him or herself, harming another individual. What is not as clear is financial harm. Whereas in Jewish law, that is clear. If somebody is going to embezzle somebody else, and I can tip you off, or tip off the police to stave off a robbery, or other types of financial ruination that a person attempts to visit and perpetrate upon somebody else. What we call this in Jewish law is a phrase in the Torah that says, Lo samod al dam re'echa. Do not stand idly by when your brother's blood is being spilled. You'll say, but, I'm bound. I can't say anything. My lips are sealed. This was told to me in confidence. So we're playing one issue versus the other. On the one hand, you're not allowed to breach it. And as I said, according to Jewish law, it's even much broader. You're never allowed to speak about somebody else in a derogatory or a defamatory fashion. And yet, when it comes to a situation of need, because somebody is going to be hurt, financially, physically, then I have a mandate. I must. And so how do we balance these two? And that's a balance that the physician has to deal with and the attorney has to deal with. I'm going to complicate it a little bit. People get married. They seek a life's partner and they do a lot of homework and research and trying to find out about another person. Imagine you're the doctor and I know that this girl that I'd like to date or that I am dating and perhaps I'd like to marry uses you as her physician. I want to know if she's in good state of health. And you treat her and you know that she has a serious disease, perhaps a life-threatening disease. And I call you up and I say, Dr. Cohn, I know there's a young lady that is a patient of yours and I'm seeing her in a social setting and I perhaps like to marry her. I just want to know, is she a healthy young lady? It's confidential information. You could lose your license by giving out that information. If you would tell me that, she has a serious disease, she has cancer, or God forbid, some other disease, are you obligated to risk your license? From a Jewish point of view, on the one hand, I'm not saying you are, but on the one hand, you're obligated to tell me because of this prohibition of lo samad al dam re'echa. Otherwise, my entire life can be ruined. You didn't say anything. Who else would know if not for the physician? And now I marry her, and who knows what kind of a life that will lead to. But if you do disclose it, you run the risk perhaps of a fine, could be an exorbitant fee, and you run the risk perhaps of losing your license entirely. That's not simple. That is not a simple issue. According to many opinions of the rabbis, loss of finances to a certain degree that wouldn't put you in total destruction but perhaps a fine, even if it's a hefty fine, maybe you'd be obligated to do. Losing your license means your livelihood's at stake, that you perhaps would not be obligated to do. But you would have to find some way to communicate to this young lady without disclosing it that this is not a good, it's not a good relationship. I'll tell you just a cute story. It's a true story. There was the head of the rabbinical court in Tel Aviv many years ago, a rabbi, very well-known rabbi, who was posed with this problem. The reason for the divorce that he was presiding over was because the woman, from a medical point of view, was not able to have children. And the couple mutually decided after 10 years to part, and they divorced. Shortly after the divorce, a fellow comes over to this rabbi, a gentleman. He says, you know, I have a cousin, 38 years old. The woman that was divorced is a nice young woman. We hear nice things about her. But you know, divorce sometimes, there are hidden agendas. Who knows what's really going on? You presided over the divorce. Tell me, do you think she would be suited for my cousin? And he was in a dilemma, because from a halachic point of view, from a Jewish point of view, I'm not allowed to disclose the proceedings of a divorce. It's private. It's an issue that relates to the two parties and the rabbi and nobody else. On the other hand, it's an issue of marriage. There's a benefit here. And from that point of view, I have an obligation to help you and not to hurt you by giving you the correct information. And he was in a dilemma. And so he went to one of the greatest rabbis of that time. This goes back some 40 years. An individual by the name of Rav Karelitz, who was known as the Chazon Ish, a giant, one of the greatest leaders of our time. And he told him the dilemma that he was in, and he said to him, you say the following words very carefully. If this potential marriage was a relative of mine, I would not go ahead with it. Nothing less and nothing more. That's what you are to tell them. So that's exactly what he did. He came back and he said to him, if it was my cousin in question, I wouldn't go ahead with it. And he figured that it would take care of matters without having to disclose the particulars of the case. Well, sure enough, 4 months later, he calls him up and he says, Mazel Tov. He says, what's the Mazel Tov? He says, you know the cousin I had told you about? He's engaged to the woman that you presided over the divorce. Look, he did what he was supposed to do, and so be it. About a year later, he calls him up again, and he says, Rabbi Frankel. Yes? He says, Mazel Tov. He says, what's the Mazel Tov? He says, they had a baby girl. He says, what? He says, why? What's wrong with that? Isn't that wonderful? He says, yes. He says, you're sure they had a baby girl? He says, absolutely. Anyway, he runs back to the rabbi, and he tells him, you will not believe what happened. And he says to him, no, you don't understand something. When a person does what's correct according to Judaism, you do what's right according to the Torah, then God works in mysterious ways. Strange things happen. Perhaps these two were not able to be a proper union to give birth to a child, and this other one was, and God intervened in a proper way. The thrust of our involvement, on the one hand, wearing the hat of a professional, the doctor, the attorney, and we are bound, and we have to follow the law to the T, not to deviate one iota, because if you're licensed, then we follow the law of the land. There are times, as I say, that there are exclusions. But then there are times that we're faced with Jewish law that's at odds with the secular law. And here it's where it's gray areas, and they're not simple. And we have to find a way around it, which is not a loophole. It's not a loophole, it's maintaining our confidence, and yet at the same time, following the guideline of the Torah law that says not to allow somebody else to be hurt in a serious way. I'm only showing you one example of what was said here. That's not a breach of confidence if I didn't say that the reason for the divorce is because she could not have children. I said, I don't think it's a good relationship. It could be for one of 100 reasons. And we have to find that niche. And we have to know when and where we have to find what to say that's appropriate and when not. Let me go into a few more details regarding this. There are times that somebody comes to a rabbi and it's not for the purpose of rabbinic intervention. It's not in the form of a spiritual advisor. If somebody calls me and says, Rabbi, do you know of any good attorneys? It's not seeking my guidance in a spiritual fashion. It's just, do you know any good people? You know a lot of people. The statute is written in such a way that the only time it's confidential is if they seek your help in a spiritual realm. And the same is true to the attorney, and the same is true to the physician. It has to be in the context of the patient-physician. And otherwise, if it's just conversational and we're just talking and schmoozing and just picking my brain, so to speak, it's a totally different relationship. And that's not bound by confidential information. But even when we disclose, and even when we have an obligation, the Torah law is very careful of a few components that have to be necessary. And I'm just going to give you 4 of them, and you'll understand how more careful we are. And I said this to one of the justices afterwards, and she said, I'd like to read more about the confidential issues according to Jewish law. So I'm going to send her the laws of the Chafetz Chaim in English, where she'll be able to study very carefully a much broader and deeper and more profound restriction according to the Torah. First and foremost, the information has to be to prevent, as I told you, a real harm. Secondly, you can't exaggerate it. It has to be exact. The information can't be, they're very sick. Can't be that way. It has to be very clear. I had a friend of mine when we were growing up together, and unfortunately he had an issue with the heart. He had a problem with his heart. And he was told that as he goes out with prospective marriage partners, at a certain point, he has to disclose the information himself. And almost invariably, after 3 or 4 dates with a young lady, and he would say, I have to just tell you that I have this and this condition, but hopefully it's fine, and the doctors gave me a clear bill of health. All the girls just, goodbye. Nice guy, but I'm not entering into this relationship. And I remember he cried to me once. He says, he was 26 at the time. He says, how am I going to get married? He says, we start a relationship. This is what I'm duty-bound to do as a religious Jew, not to deceive another person. And so at a certain point, I disclosed what I have to, but nobody's going to marry me. I told him, Moshe, don't worry. You do what's right and what, according to the rabbis, is the correct thing, and God has his plan for you. I had no idea what that plan was, but I knew 100% that if he does the correct thing, then it will work out. Sure enough, about 6 months later, he's going out with a girl, and again, about the 4th date, he says to the girl, I have to tell you, I have this and this condition. She says, well, I'll check that out very carefully. My father's a cardiologist. And sure enough, the doctor researched it. He wasn't concerned. He felt quite confident he was healthy and well. Today, thank God, they have 5 lovely children. They've been married already a good 10, 15 years. And that's how God orchestrated his life, because he did what was right and he followed the path of Torah the way it should be. So we have to tell the truth, and we can't exaggerate it. The desire can't be out of animosity. I'm going to get this guy and I'll talk the town red about him. Or he wants to get a job somewhere and I'll tell everybody about him. It has to be out of a genuine feeling of not allowing an next person to be hurt or to be deceived. The least damaging means of expression have to be used. If I could say the same thing by just saying, this girl is not for you, then I can't say that she has this and this malady or she's a terrible person. I could just say, trust me, you trust me, I'm your best friend. This is not for you. You want to go into a relationship with this person in law and start a law firm together. And I'm a friend of yours, and I tell you, I just don't think this is good. But tell me why, I want to know. Give me all the juice on him. According to Jewish law, I'm not allowed to say a thing. Unless you're not going to listen to what I say to you, unless I disclose it. But if you trust me and I say that this is not proper, and it won't be to your advantage, and you're willing to part at that point, then that's the extent of what I'm allowed to disclose. I must also tell you very clearly that you're not allowed to repeat it to anybody else. This information is for your ears and your ears only, because it's only beneficial to you. So you can't go around saying, hey, you know what, I just heard from John, told me today, such and such about Michael. Terrible things. Person transgresses on gossip, slander, according to Torah law. And so we have issues of confidence. And I'm glad that at least in New York State, they've come to the understanding that it's not for them, and it's not for the court, the secular courts, to involve themselves in Jewish law and in religion, because they cannot tell us what is confidential according to our religion and what we must disclose and what we not disclose. But to the professional, although they also can't dictate it, but you're licensed, as I had said at the opening, and so you're bound by their authority as besides God's authority. And you have to find a way, and there is a way that each person can find, not violating the secular law, and at the same time, not violating the Jewish law. And it is in this way that we conduct our lives, in all activities that we do. As professionals, we live in the land, and we are law-abiding citizens. As Jews, we are responsible to a higher authority, and that's the authority of Torah, the authority of God. The two usually can be worked out quite well, and they can coexist and co-dwell. And when there is a difficulty that you just don't see any way around it, that's what we have rabbis for, to guide us. And one asks, and one questions, and one finds out, what do you do? Am I obligated to take a penalty? Am I supposed to risk my license? So-and-so might be hurt, so-and-so might be killed. Who knows what the situation may be. But in more serious cases, clearly the law does understand that there are situations that breach of confidentiality is allowed. More than that, it's obligatory upon the doctor or the lawyer to disclose, and by not disclosing in certain situations, you're held accountable as an accomplice, and one has to find out where and one of those situations are. I'm going to stop there from other issues, but I'd like to open the floor to questions, and I'm sure there are many, and so more will be expounded on through the questions and answers. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Can I just interrupt for 1 second? Can we just bench for a few minutes, and then anyone who does have to leave because of the lunch hour, and then Weinberger is free until at least 3 o'clock to answer questions. So any of you, I'm sure there are many lawyers here, many doctors would be happy to take questions. So I'm just going to ask someone who did wash, who would like to just bench for us. And let me just, again, take the opportunity thanking you all for coming. It's nice to see such a large crowd. We hope to see you all back on Monday, August the 26th. Hey, did you wash it? Do you want to leave? Again, this evening at TLC, the Torah Learning Center of Northbrook, 3000 Dundee. Another topic, and the topic is going to be the Jewish view of the constellations, the zodiac, and luck, mazel. What do Jews believe about mazel? So if any of you are free this evening, or you know people who live up in the northern suburbs, 7:45 this evening, 3000 Dundee. We look forward to seeing you. If you have any questions, Rabbi Weinberger. Thank you again.
Yes.
You touched lightly about the Shidduch process, about,
Right.
confidentiality. How
Mm-hmm.
and the gentleman had a criminal background. Now this person, did his time, served his time. I felt that the girl
Should know.
However, this whole issue of it's a new life, I've done
Right.
my dues, I've done time, and
I'm going to repeat it. Yeah.
sometimes a little bit of knowledge is
Good.
not good, but for the sense of a should've, even if I would say that should've isn't for you.
Right. Okay, let me just repeat. The question is a very valid one. We are all, even if you're not practicing law or you're not a practitioner of medicine and you're not a rabbi, you're not a psychologist, every human being on a regular basis is faced with issues of confidentiality. You're highlighting one area that affects many people. When people seek knowledge from you regarding a potential life partner, and you know them, you live in the same community, perhaps you went to school with them, and so they call you up and they say, tell me about this young lady, tell me about this young man, and you're on the firing line. And issues then come up. What do I say? I know things about their background, things of the recent, things of the past. What can I say? When I say is life and death, that's really what it is. You are the executioner, if you will, by saying something that could be the end of this person. Nobody will go out with them. Or by not saying anything, you're putting other people in a potential harm. So the question particularly that you raised was somebody who had a criminal background, served time, hopefully has been rehabilitated, and this young lady knows nothing of this. The question is, do you disclose that? So first of all, one rule of thumb regarding personal disclosures of this sort is something that is known and that's clear that a person can see or that everyone will know about, you have no obligation to say. Let me explain. Say the person has a physical defect of some sort. Maybe it's a lisp, maybe they limp somewhat. And if I say even the slightest thing, I say they have a slight lisp, to the person hearing it, oh boy, they probably can't even talk. That's just the reality of it. And they'll not even be interested in me seeing this person. I'm not obligated, and not only am I not obligated, I'm obligated not to say anything because the person will see for themselves. Either it bothers you, it doesn't bother you. Either you like it or you don't like it. And different people, different things and different levels of problems bother different individuals. But you're talking about a situation where the person will not know. You're privy to this information. Maybe they did time in another state, and there's no way that in this community where this young lady lives that anybody would know about this. So the rule, according to Jewish law, is very simple. If the majority of people would not want such a relationship, then you have an obligation to tell her in advance. Or, better than that would be that you tell the person, look, I'm not saying anything, but you have an obligation to tell her yourself, and if you don't by date 3 or date 4, then I will. That's better, because this way it at least gets off the ground. This is assuming that the person in your mind, in your opinion, from what you hear, has changed, and his life now is a good one, it's a healthy one. So on date 3 or date 4, whenever it may be, he's going to disclose it. The girl might have a different picture of it. But otherwise, you're obligated to tell, because the average person would not want to marry somebody with a criminal record. Unless you find a girl like that, then it's a different story. And they both have a record. Yes, sir. Right. Good point. Yeah, that scares you right away. Right. Okay. So I didn't go into that, but yes, the question is, you see, if I have to ask further advice of what I should say and what I shouldn't say, that's a red flag. That's like red flags all over the place. That's like saying everything. Oh, let me get back to you. Let me ask my rabbi if I should tell you. That's a giveaway. So I didn't go into this because it's a side issue, but it's good that you brought it up because it should be stated. One has to be a shrewd individual. You have to be smart. You have to be savvy, not, to misconstrue and not to falsify, but you don't have to be an idiot. You have to be very, very sharp. Somebody calls you and asks you information, be it, as I say, to get a partner in the business, be it for a marriage, a potential marriage partner, or some other situation. The point is that if you're not sure, do you say it, don't you say it? And as I say, you're playing with lives. This is very serious. Not saying or yes saying. Both ways, you're playing with fire. So you have to be smart as to know what to say, that not to throw the person a curveball in a way where they get wind of the fact that something's going on. I'll give you an example. A girl once called me about a young man that she was dating and about to get engaged. And I knew that the boy was of average intelligence. The girl was brilliant. My wife knew her from school. The girl was absolutely brilliant. Now, that doesn't mean that this relationship will go sour. It doesn't mean it's terrible. But on paper, it just doesn't seem that it's going to mesh. Was she going to look up to him? You want to look up to your husband. And the husband is very mediocre in everything. And I knew this, but I wasn't sure, do I say it or don't say it? So what I said was very clearly the following. I said, I know him from school, but I really don't know him well. And I have to find out more about him. He's a nice fellow, that I do know. Let me make some inquiries regarding this particular issue, and I'll get back to you tomorrow. She didn't think anything of it. That seems very legitimate. I was told that I must tell her the truth. She has to know that the level of intelligence, he was very, he was able to impress her quite well. So she assumed, he was talking about Judaism, about the things he was studying, things that she didn't study. And she assumed, he's very bright. But the reality was that he wasn't. And I was told I must tell her, then it's her decision. She decided to break off. Thank God she married somebody of equal intelligence to her. But when you communicate that you're going to ask, you don't say, hey, I better ask somebody. I'll let you know if I could tell you this. That person's a pretty big fool. You have to find a way on the spot, something quick that you can just quickly get out of it and say, you know what, I got to go right now. I got to pick up my kids from carpool. Well, you don't have any kids. But the point is, so then you don't say that. If you have kids, it's carpool time. If it's not, I have an appointment in the city. I got to run. We'll speak later. So what was it again you want to? All right, I'll get back to you later this evening. I'll call you. The person doesn't think twice. Things like that happen. In the interim, you make the call, you find out what you should say, what you shouldn't say, and then you get back to the person. I've rarely had a problem. But you're right. If you start hesitating and something, now let me think. Oh, yeah. Oh, boy, that was, yeah, well, I don't know. Nice guy. When you say nothing, you've already destroyed it right there. So you have to be careful how you speak, but you have to be shrewd and smart. Any other questions? Yes? Right? Right.
The question is, shouldn't the couple originally be upfront with one another and shouldn't
Absolutely.
be perfect?
Correct.
Why don't we have the courage to be able to see what this whole...
Okay, so you and I know we live in a very strange world where people believe, the question was, why can't people just be upfront and whatever the relationships are and be honest and truthful? Because when people are upfront, they know they have blemishes, and they think their blemishes will frighten somebody off, and therefore they don't want to disclose it. I'll tell you, I had a friend of mine who did exactly as you suggested. He was so upfront, he told all of his faults to every girl he went out with. Do you know that what? That's not the right way, exactly, because everybody has faults. But if a person's going to stand there and says, now let me tell you something. I'm stingy, and I snore at night, and I have this fixation and I have this problem. Now, even though the young lady might have a similar bag of problems, and we all do, but if you're going to be so foolish as to disclose them all, although we all know that we have them, then you'll frighten off the whole world. And he did frighten off almost the whole world. And at age 43, finally I was invited to his wedding. And he met his type. And he met a young lady the same way. And as all the faults he told her, she told him equal amount that she had. And that was it. This was the shidduch made in heaven. And but you know, that's not the norm of society. It's to withhold serious information that is asked of you as the third party. You know, girls and young men, women going out and they're dating, of course they should be upfront. But, you know, there's only a certain amount that you expect people to speak about themselves. Research and inventory on somebody's life, whether it's for business, whether it's for marriage, must be done. That's the world we live in. So we hope people are honest and truthful, and yet there is a need not to be naive and to research an individual. And that happens to be an interesting issue according to Jewish law, by the way. As much as I told you, you're not allowed to denigrate and slander and you know, be a rumor monger about somebody. If there's a benefit, and it's a business relationship, it's a marriage relationship, I'm allowed to ask not one person, not 5 people, as many people as I so desire until I feel comfortable. I can ask 30 people about somebody until I feel absolutely sure, okay, now I'm comfortable that the information is correct and honest. And that's permissible as well. Yes, ma'am. With the murder case. Oh, not the murder case. With the medical problem. Right. So, again, I go back to what I said to you before. This was a religious person, and it's a religious doctor. The patient was religious. Now, on the one hand, I assume that the doctor is confidential because he wears the hat of a physician licensed by whatever state he's in. And I'm well aware of a physician-patient law of confidentiality. So I assume my doctor will not disclose. But if I have a religious doctor, and I know that according to religious law, there are times that if he would be asked about me for as a marriage, he would be obligated to disclose, then I would expect that that would happen. Now, he has to disclose it in a way where he's not breaching his legal responsibility. So he can't say that, yes, this young lady is being treated by me for this and this disease. But he could say to the young man, I don't think this is a good relationship for you. That's not breaching confidentiality, and it accomplishes what he has to as a religious physician in saving this young man from a serious problem. Now, you can ask me a good question, and I think I answered it with the story, but it is a valid question. If everybody's going to be truthful and say what's correct and what's honest, and, you know, he's going to say, when asked about her, if she's healthy and well, you know, how is she ever going to get married? So I'll tell you just one final story, and the story is very representative of how God orchestrates the world. And he runs the world like we can't even begin to think. The story is, it's a true story. There was a particular town, and in Europe, it was a small town, and there was one man who was the despise of everybody. They all hated him. I don't know what he did. Maybe he did things that weren't so good. Nobody liked him. His mazel, he had 3 girls to marry off. And he had only one friend in the entire town. And he came crying to the rabbi. He said, I'm trying to marry off my 3 daughters. And, you know, anybody who they're going to get information from in this town, they're going to say, he's no good, he's terrible, his kids are no good. I'll never be able to marry them off. So he comes to this great rabbi who was the Ger Rebbe. He was the rabbi of the city of Ger, great Hasidic leader. And he says, I have the shidduch, I have the mate for your daughter. It was the first daughter at that time that was going out. He says, how could you have the, what are you talking about? He says, a man came into me this morning and he asked me about this and this family. And he told me he asked a certain individual and he got very good reports. And that was the one friend that you have in town. So imagine out of the entire community, you happen to have asked the one friend, and he says that he's ready to go ahead with it. So I'm telling you that that's the right shidduch. Because if out of the entire community, he picked the one guy that was the friend, perchance, that's God's direct intervention that your daughter should be able to get married. And I say to you the same thing. There are issues, and there are serious issues. And we are not to play God. God can take care of himself, and he's going to find the proper mate for this young lady and for that man and for this person who is rehabilitating himself from an unfortunate past or from a disease that's a serious one. And God will make it so that either somebody with a similar issue or even not with a similar issue, like the case of the young man I told you where the father happens to be the cardiologist, or it's a situation that the people they happen to have asked were not the doctor. You think everybody calls up the doctor and says, let me find out who this girl sees as a physician? No, they call up people and say, do you know, is she in good health? They ask friends, they ask relatives, they might ask neighbors. Well, we all think so. Fine. So as far as we know, she's in good health. Very few people call up the doctor. So if they're not calling the doctor, now there's a whole different issue, which I will just throw out, but I'm not going to really go into because that's a whole different discussion. If you're not asked, but you know that A is going out with B, and you know that either A or B has some serious problem that should be disclosed, but they're not going to disclose it, do you have an obligation as an outsider who knows this information to tell it to one of the prospective parties? You weren't even asked. And the law of lo samed al dam reyecha, do not stand idly by when your brother's blood is being spilled, applies even to an outsider. So here you are, a friend or an acquaintance, and you know that this information has not been reported and it has not been disclosed, and they don't intend on disclosing it, and you know this information, and you have an obligation to go over to them and tell them either you disclose it or I have to disclose it. That's a whole different scenario, but that's a very realistic one as well. Yes?
I'm in the medical profession, and I have a friend who is working in drug research.
Right.
And people sign up as guinea pigs,
Mm-hmm.
and they're doing
Research.
on not government-approved drugs.
Correct.
You know, there's adverse effects, there's placebos. And I asked my friend, ethically, you know, you're always in conflict.
Mhm.
You know that this drug is bad. Do you tell
She knows it's
people
bad, or they're
there's
researching.
adverse reaction?
Uh-huh.
She said, well, if a person signs up as a drug subject, they know that
There are risks.
what those risks are, and the outcome, or the long term.
They probably don't even know.
So there's like a failure to disclose. But she says that's, you know, and I say to her, how does this attack your conscience when you know that? And it's always that conflict between the right thing to do.
Yeah, but
and
you see, that's a little different because, I mean, I don't know whether according to law, do they have to write all of the known side effects that they know of? No. So that means if you're signing up as a test case to be a guinea pig, you know in advance that there could be risks. Well, you don't know that. So then you have to be the educated consumer. And then you have to say, look, are there any risks of life here? Are there any risks of serious debilitating diseases that I could contract? You know, you have to ask that. The onus is upon you. If you're willing to sign on the dotted line and say, yes, I don't mind being a test case, are you aware that there are risks? Yes. Now, it behooves you to ask what those risks are. If not, then I'm not obligated to say anything. I'm totally clear then. Yes.
I'd like to ask you a question. It's not exactly on point. It's a corollary of what you're saying.
Okay.
Let's say you have a daughter's getting married, and you don't like who she's going to marry.
Right.
Now, do you have a duty to speak out to her and tell her that you're going to prevent the marriage and have her hate you the rest of your life?
Okay.
Or do you let the marriage go through, and
Mhm.
she gets divorced, and she moves it back in with you?
Okay. It's
Which is the way you go?
okay. Excellent question. Let me just repeat it. As a parent, you have a child who's already a young adult deciding to marry a certain individual that's not pleasing to either yourself or your spouse or both. And do you interfere? May you block this relationship? Or do you have no right, you know, to interfere, knowing that the consequences, unfortunately, might just unfold the way that you anticipate they will? So the rule is as follows. A child, although has an obligation to honor a father and a mother, when it comes to choosing a life's partner, that obligation is no longer. They may choose whichever life's partner they wish. However, if the individual that they choose to marry will be a shame and denigration, will impact directly upon you, not her life, but your life, then she may not do that. And you have a right to step in as the father, as the mother, and say, we are not permitting you to go through with this. And as a parent, you have to honor our wishes. Now, it's simple to say that, and yet it's very complex, because in the real world, there are young men and young women who will go ahead with it anyway, and they will do what they want. And there are parents who then make decisions. Do we disown our children? Do we disinherit them? Do we ban them from coming to our house? Will we have nothing to do with them or their children? And that's very complex, and that's a personal decision that a family has to make. You know, what form of retribution do you take because your child did not follow suit? And some families make peace with it, others do not, and that's a very individualized theme. But clearly, when their life's partner will impact upon you in a negative way, or you feel will be an embarrassment or shame, then you have a right to interfere, and the child, according to Jewish law, is obligated to honor the wishes of the parent.
The parent, as far as I'm concerned, may not like the person.
Right.
And they can express what they must accept.
Okay, that's your personal view. Others would not necessarily agree with that. You see, there are
I don't
cases...
care what others
No, okay,
do.
that's...
I'm talking about myself.
Fine. Okay, as I said, that how different people deal with it, you will find a range, from A to Z. But I just wanted to state very clearly the halachic position according to Jewish law, what it is regarding that. Now, there are times that you're afraid that the child will marry somebody and will harm them in one form or another. It could be, I'll give you a simple example. I'm involved with an organization called Shalom Task Force, which deals with spousal abuse. And it's horrendous of what we hear and what's going on. And what goes on in the world goes on in the Jewish world, perhaps to a little bit of a lesser degree, but it does go on. So if you feel that you see signs, telling signs as an adult, as a parent, of emotional abuse, physical abuse from a potential marriage partner, there's no doubt that you have an obligation to step in to save your child. And as a parent, to say, I'm standing back, they're an adult, let them make their own decision, I think would be quite inappropriate. You would not be doing yourself or your child any good service. So they might not be happy, but that's your obligation. As I once told a mother who said to me, when my children get married, they're on their own, I don't interfere. So I said to her, if your daughter was running in the street and crossing the street and there was a huge tractor trailer coming down the road and she didn't see it because it was blocked, you're not going to run. Not necessarily.
Well, there you are.
Okay, I told you, each family deals with it differently. Any other questions? Yes.
I would advise somebody, professionally, they are required to disclose something, but according to Jewish law, they are not allowed to.
Give me an example of
For
that.
example, somebody who is a psychologist in a school, and the parents are, let's say, what is legally defined as abusive, but upon consulting with a rabbi, the rabbi said that this is not considered abuse, and it's something that we can take care of without getting the
Professionals involved. Okay, so I'll give you a good example of that. A little similar. Let's say we have a person who's a molester, okay? And according to Jewish law, that's a crime, and that's an individual who has to be reported. And the school says, you know what, we'll take care of it. So under most circumstances, it would probably have to be reported anyway. Why? Because you generally cannot take care of it. The effect that it could have on others, we're not a police force. Just like abuse, I just spoke a minute about physical abuse. People say to me, they're going to report it to the police. How dare they report it to the police? You know what, I'm going to wind up in jail. They're a Jewish person, they dare not. I say, look, there's no rabbi that's going to stop the physical abuse. It's a syndrome, it's innate, it's a problem. The only thing that's going to stop them is the law. So then according to Jewish law, we have to stop the perpetrator from affecting others. And the only way we can do that is using the legal system. And then Jewish law says, yes, even though we would feel that it shouldn't be done, but we have no choice, then that's the only way it can be taken care of, then that's the way it has to be done. And schools deal with this with great trepidation. And it's not a simple matter. Yet to just blow the horn on somebody without analyzing it and discussing it is also very, very dangerous to do, because you're destroying a person's life, and you first have to see if there's another way to deal with it. Any other questions? No. Okay, I thank you very much. A pleasure meeting all of you.